Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me in this conversation today, this bonus conversation. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and today we're doing something a little different with this bonus episode. You may remember that a while ago we spoke with Sergey from the CMM Institute, and in that conversation we reflected on the episodes with Chris Wells and Emma Nicholson, and the episodes with Stephanie Higgs. Today I am joined by Ilene Wasserman, who you will remember from our conversation with her and Jeff Branch, and I'm also joined by Arthur Jensen, both of whom are on the board of stewards for the CMM Institute as well. Because reflection is such an important part of the process of moving towards more intentionally creating better social worlds, recognizing our patterns, and being thoughtful in our meaning making, we wanted to model that for you in these episodes, so this is just another chance for us to do that. This time we are offering our reflections on my episodes with Paul Porter and with Sev Burton. So of course you'll want to go back and listen to those conversations before listening to this one if you haven't yet. If you have, and maybe you need a refresher, the links to these episodes are in the description, so you can find your way back there first. The things I'll have you keep in mind as we go into this conversation are to try to remember from those conversations what lingering questions you still had, what thoughts or feelings or ideas those conversations brought up in you initially, and how you've maybe continued to reflect on them or how you'd like to continue to reflect on them. Okay. Let's jump in with Arthur and Ilene. Hi, Ilene and Arthur. Thank you so much for joining me for this reflection today.
Thank you for inviting us.
So nice to be together.
It's so good to be with you and get to be in conversation with you today. I'm wondering if we can start out with some introductions. Ilene, I know people have already gotten to hear more about you in our conversation that we had with Jeff, which people can go back and listen to. So perhaps, Arthur, you could start us off by telling us about you so that people have context for this conversation today.
Well, I'm a lifelong academic. I retired from Syracuse University 3 years ago, and I got my start at the University of Massachusetts studying with Barnett Pierce and Vern Cronin. So I got an early introduction to CMM. And then went off on my own directions, and probably for 10 or 15 years, I used CMM, but in a limited way in my teaching and in research. And then about 20 years ago, maybe, I reconnected with Barnett. I went to a gathering in his honor and came away from that with the idea for Cosmopolis 2045, imagining a social community set in the future. And when I presented that idea to Barnett and Kim, they were very enthusiastic. They became the number one fans in support of that idea. And that actually led me to becoming a member of the board of the CMM Institute, where I met Ilene and others, members of our group. So that's sort of my quick history.
Yeah, that's a great start. Yeah, Ilene, can you share more about your connection to CMM as well?
Sure. I encountered CMM when mid-career, I decided to pursue my doctorate while working full-time. That's how I met Barnett Pierce. And it was such a wonderful fit for what I wanted to pursue. My career, as you know, has really been around helping organizations become more inclusive and create more inclusive cultures and address how diversity and equity can come alive on teams and make for more vibrant engagement. So I came to do my doctorate mid-career because I wanted to challenge how I was asking questions. And I also wanted to explore when DE&I is bringing life to organizations, what is supporting that? What is making that so? And meeting Barnett and I say meeting the CMM at the same time was a wonderful way of looking at a wonderful model for supporting how we look at those social worlds and how we look at the emergence of meaning and relationships in conversations. So that happened. I met Barnett in the late 90s. We actually were together birthing the CMM Institute. It had a little precursor but we created the CMM Institute. Really, it was Barnett and Kim that were the leaders of that. And we've since been working as a board of stewards. And that's how I met Arthur. Meeting Arthur has been just so expansive for me around having these conversations and making sense of different turns in the history of DE&I and where we are today and what's the future that we can create together.
I think that's a great start. I guess I should have said at the very beginning, but today our reflection is going to be on the conversation that I had with Paul Porter, as well as the conversation I had with Zev Burton. And these two people are connected in my mind just because of how I know them, both through my experience with speech, which we talked about in all those episodes, since that was a significant part of all of our lives. So yeah, that's kind of a loose connection for both of them, but I was interested to see the ways in which the themes of those conversations mirrored each other, or in their uniqueness, there was something to say about both of them and value to be added when looking at those together. So since I got my chance to actually be in those conversations, I'd love to just start with passing it back to you all to hear some of your initial thoughts on either or both of those conversations at this time as you were listeners of those conversations.
I'll be glad to start. We start with Paul Porter's interview. There were a number of themes that came out of the interview, but the ones that sort of stuck with me or struck me, he talked about absolutes and complexity. He talked about multicultural competency and cultural humility. And as I thought about them, those sort of go hand in hand. I imagine that's why Paul brought them up, because he saw them in the same way. It's that notion of growing up, in an environment of absolute right and wrong, good and bad. And I think the way he put it is there's little need to explore the complexity of moral issues if you grow up in that kind of environment.
Yeah, right.
And I think, my own experience mirrors that. And it made me think of a Franciscan priest who I've become enamored with in terms of his writings, Richard Rohr. And he talks about spiritual maturity as a movement from three phases. In the first phase, he calls them boxes. So there's 3 boxes. The first box is the box of order. And that is a box of fixed rules and absolute beliefs and values, which we take to being they are true for all times and in all situations. And he says we probably need to start there as children. We need a firm foundation. But if we get stuck there, if we stay in that box of order, we'd never grow up. We don't become spiritually or morally mature. And so the next box that you have to go through, in his view, to get there is a box of disorder, where you begin to have doubts and you question the things you were taught or the beliefs and values of your tribe, your group. And a lot of people get stuck there. They just become disillusioned with everything and they never regain any footing and so on. But the third box is a box of reorder, in which Rohr says that's how we gain spiritual maturity, because we begin to realize, and this is what Paul was talking about, we begin to realize the world's more complex, and that the absolute rules just apply sometimes and sometimes they don't. And we need the ability to see the nuances and understand, well, what will work in this situation or that situation. So that theme, to me, requires the other 2 features, cultural humility.
Right.
Because there's an arrogance when we have a sense of certainty about things. We just develop a kind of arrogance that puts people off and defeats our purposes if we're trying to convince them that our way is right. And then the multicultural competence is, in order to be open to complexity, you need to understand people in their own words, in their own ways of living and being. And so those themes really struck me when Paul was talking about his approach to diversity and equity and inclusion.
Yeah, I related to that as well. Seeing now where I'm at in my life, being able to look back and say, wow, my childhood, my growing up, my way of thinking was very black and white, like Paul was talking about. I also was not taught or didn't learn in those earlier ages. It wasn't modeled for me how to question and how to lean into the complexity of things. There was more of a let's be ignorant of the complexity of things in favor of maintaining this simpler worldview. And it's helpful for me to not be as like resentful of that, maybe, when I hear something like this 3-box metaphor or way of understanding, to say this is something that a lot of people go through, and in ways you have to be in box 1 before you can be in box 2. And so once you overcome that arrogance of box 1, you maybe hit the humility of box 2. And then for me, what I'm realizing is once you get past that humility, or maybe that kind of tenderness as everything you thought you know falls apart in front of you, then is when you can lean in. And in my case, at least, I felt very excited to be able to get to do that reordering. And so maybe people have different attitudes going into that. But to me, learning about CMM-ish ideas like meaning making, it's so interesting to be able to apply meaning making. But even just for me, the fact that we can talk about meaning making as a process we do was new, because when you live in that black and white thinking, you spend 0 time thinking about how meaning is made and how you get to play a role in that.
Right. That's very true. Another way of talking about the same thing is a developmental psychologist by the name of Robert Keegan wrote a wonderful book several years ago called In Over Our Heads. The way he put it is, our values and beliefs can either have a hold on us or we can have a hold on them. And I think if you're in box 1, the values and beliefs of your tribe have a hold on you, and you're just so embedded in them, you don't know any alternatives or any different way of thinking. But as you mature and develop a different level of consciousness, is what Keegan would call it, you begin to see how those values and beliefs are still important. They just aren't relevant to every single situation you face. And appreciating complexity is realizing when those rules apply and when they don't.
I really appreciate your starting us off, Arthur, with the order, disorder, reorder framework. It really touches on a couple of other lenses with which I was listening to both of the interviews. And certainly the human development lens is one of those places that I call home. And if I could build on what you brought up around Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy, because they've been very strong collaborators, is that they talk about human development and adult development as the increasing capacity for complexity. And so when we talk about starting out with those kind of polarities of right and wrong and good and bad, to go easy on ourselves in terms of how we judge ourselves in that place, or how we judge those who we were influenced by and socialized by, because it is a developmental stage. And I want to name right now that as I'm talking about this, I'm using a developmental paradigm, which in and of itself is one paradigm, not the only paradigm.
Right.
And when we talk about developmental stages as the increasing capacity for complexity, that we recognize some of the challenges of embracing worlds of diversity, because it requires us to be able to hold how we see things, how we understand things, our meaning-making structures, side by side with others that may be similar and may be different. And so Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy talk about those stages, where stages 2 and 3 may be more concrete. And that gives us the grounding to have a sense of making sense of the world. And it's from that strong foundation that you can then reach into sitting in the complexity, that my way of thinking is one way of thinking. Even my developmental model, my commitment to a developmental model is one way of thinking. And that's where I think CMM offers in its models and frameworks footings. It's kind of like you're hiking, and some of those layers of thinking about things in terms of stories lived, stories told, the name of your podcast, or recognizing that there are different contexts to elevate. We may elevate the developmental context, but we may also think about things as each turn of our encounters is growing and expanding how we're making sense of things. I want to bring it back to two things. One is that when I'm doing work with clients, whether it's individuals, teams, or organizations, the whole order, disorder, reorder goes back to another great in our field, Kurt Lewin. Kurt Lewin was a psychologist that came out of Nazi Germany in the 30s. And what he brought to life was recognizing the worst of group dynamics. And how can we learn from that to elevate the best of group dynamics? And to recognize that change is around looking at the order. And he talked about the disorder as the unfreezing in order so that we could refreeze. And we're doing that all the time in our adult learning models.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I really like the idea of growing up and seeing that as a natural process, because if you're maybe what I experienced a little bit, if you're experiencing that transition from order to disorder and you're not framing it as this is part of growing up, this is part of becoming adult, this is something everyone goes through, that's really unsettling. And you maybe spend more time saying, why is this happening to me? Instead of leaning in to it as a natural thing that everyone experiences. But also the parallel I see is that we're growing up as individuals and gaining that capacity to hold more complexity. And I think that same language can apply to a society, or probably what your work is with organizations, where it's like, as a society, we're also needing to grow up and move past the discomfort of moving between these boxes or stages. And that's how in organizations, we start making room for DEI. In a society, we start becoming more inclusive and valuing equity and justice more, when the society can grow up as well and see it as a natural evolution of the society.
And one of the things that I just want to add to that is that it isn't linear. Hopefully it's a generative spiral, and there's discomfort along the way. There's discomfort in challenging not just what you know, but how you know.
Yeah. What we're talking about reminds me also of something Paul Porter said. He said, how we see the self sets the table for how we see others. And I thought about that a lot, because one of the things I try to tell myself all the time is, except for the accident of birth, I would believe very different things than I believe. I would be a different person. I would have different values and so on. And that helps me see my own complexity and then be able to see the complexity of others. I forget that at times, and it goes awry, but I still think that's a good place to start in terms of how you think about inclusiveness. Is, would I include myself if I were born somewhere else and became a different kind of person?
I love that, Arthur. Just thinking about, but for the accident of birth, I'm reinforced in my reflecting every day about what privileges I have that are reinforced in every encounter. I love when Paul talked about how my story meeting your story makes the conversation bigger. Because and this was something, Abbie, you and Paul had a very rich encounter about, which is looking at fixed versus expansive opportunities for storytelling. And one of the things that I hear in all of my conversations every day is, what are some of the taken for granted assumptions about the story? And recognizing that with CMM, the next encounter changes how we have known things in the past. So the future is always changing the storytelling of the past.
Yeah. As you talk about privilege, a couple obvious ones come to mind. I have privilege because I'm white. I have privilege because of my class. And then also I'm being brought back to my conversation with Zev, where his explanation of a better social world is one where people have, I can't remember the exact language he used, but have the comfort and have their basic needs met so that they can then create. And I thought that was such a great point and perspective where he's saying, people in war times or in depressions, they're not creating because those basic needs aren't being met. And so that's another privilege that I don't think about a lot, but is a privilege that I have the privilege to create. There's people who don't get so far as talking about DEI or having the kind of conversations we get to have, or getting to have the privilege of spending time devoting yourself to a theory like CMM and seeing your life through those lenses because you're just trying to be alive. And so I recognize that too as a privilege that I'm very thankful for, because I enjoy getting to be in that creative space. And I just appreciated that that was Zeb's way of describing what a better social world is. And in a similar way to my conversation with Paul, I think that's a very expansive way of looking at the world, to say, what I really hope for people is for them to get to create. Because when they create, I create, we all create, we do that growing up. We do that innovating together in an expansive way.
Yep.
Talking about Zev for a moment, one of the things that I resonated with Zev about is the use of humor as a way of dealing with oppressive situations. And in a way, when we've been talking about moving from the making it personal to looking at the systemic, when Arthur talked about having our stories, or that we tell our own stories rather than having our stories tell us,
Yeah, right.
That when he gave the examples that he gave around the use of humor, who gets to use humor around clearly oppressive encounters? When he talks about humor at the concentration camp, if I'm having my head shaved and I can say, thank you, I needed a haircut anyway, it's a very different thing than the person in charge saying, look at me, I'm giving you a haircut because you needed a haircut. And so how do we look at the use of humor as a clue and a window into the experience of the unknown, untold stories of those that don't get to tell their stories?
Wow. Yeah.
One of his examples he used that I really loved was the one in Serbia where the image of Milosevic is on a barrel and people are using baseball bats to strike it. And somebody wants the police to, stop this nonsense. And so they arrest the barrel. I just thought that was great. That was so perfect. They had a lot of examples along those lines. And the other thing that he shared and I resonated with it because I watch John Oliver's show every week. But he talked about the John Oliver effect. People actually listen to the show. They go to the show for the humor, but they stay for the message. And that's true from my perspective, because it helped me understand why, if I tell somebody that I watched John Oliver, they're likely to say, why don't you watch real news? Comedians don't do news. But I realize it's the humor about the news that makes it come alive, makes it stay with you longer than just a traditional newscast. I appreciated that way of using humor to get us to think and to be concerned about issues we ought to be concerned about, but haven't had the time for.
Yeah. One of the things Zev talked about is how much goes into that framing, elevating that humor that I know sometimes I'm a little uncomfortable with. And then I have to ask myself, what is that discomfort doing? What is that humor? And it goes back to what you said initially, Arthur, about Richard Rohr talking about disruption. And both Zev and Paul talked about disruption as a pathway to expansion. And that humor disrupts our way of knowing so that we then can listen to the story.
Yeah, I think, Ilene, you're right. Like it gives us clues, kind of like you were saying before, to help understand the material or the people that the material affects better. Part of what my thinking was after my conversation with Zev was that wherever you're watching the news, you're getting a certain framing of it. maybe you're watching the 5 o'clock news or, whatever news station and feeling like you're getting an objective telling of it, but you're not. There's always framing, which I think is almost okay. There are objective facts, but a lot of times in the stories we're telling, the stories themselves aren't objective. And so part of the meaning making is understanding the context of these stories in their culture. And I think that's why somebody like John Oliver or, different comedians talking about current events is actually valuable to help understand the event in the context of a culture and say, how are people understanding this? How are people relating to it? Why is that specific joke about it funny? Why does that resonate or not with the people who are being affected by X, Y, or Z current event that's being talked about?
I like your example of the news being framed, because if we know anything about communication theory, there's always a frame. You can't get away from frames. So it's not like there is a frame-free way of understanding things.
And that goes back to what Zev talked about around data storytelling.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, there's an intentionality of looking at what story is the data telling us. And I really loved the way he challenged the whole idea about what data matters, quantitative or qualitative, and even talking about quantitative data, we're choosing a story and supporting it with data. And that's so important as a lesson. I know that what Zev is talking about around data is so important in this world where data is showing up in a lot of different places.
Yeah. My main takeaway from my conversation with Zev was just that I was genuinely so surprised at how many parallels I was able to draw between my way of thinking and his way of thinking or approaching topics in terms of the meaning making, in terms of the curiosity, in terms of the context building. Because going into that conversation, I was, way oversimplifying, but feeling like Zev lives in a different world than I do. He's talking about international politics and data science, and those are not things I am fluent in. I do not understand all of that. But then he made it really accessible. And I just kept seeing all of these parallels to say, oh, you're doing meaning making in the exact same way that I am. You're just applying it to this thing. And yeah, I was just thankful for how he made kind of his areas of expertise or his fields of study feel very tangible and then also very relatable.
Yeah. Shortly after listening to your interview with Zev, I started reading a book on research called Design Thinking and Social Constructions by Ilene, Camargo Borges, and Sheila McNamee. And they make a distinction between traditional research, which looks at data from the past. We collect data. That data relates to things that have happened already. So it's like we're looking for patterns in the past to help us understand what our options are, I guess. But they talk about a social constructionist perspective on research, which is about future forming. It is about the unfolding of data in real time that we don't know what that data means until the next turn and somebody adds to it. And so we're forming a future as we talk, as we speak. And I just think that's an interesting way of looking at data, as was the way he presented in terms of storytelling. But it just was interesting to me that I heard him talking about it in that way and then started reading the book in which they describe data a little bit differently. And so it was interesting and enlightening.
The strongest connection between these two episodes for me is that in my conversation with Paul, he's giving these great explanations and definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, how he understands that work, what his role in it is. And what I really liked that we kind of got to, which was a new thought for me, is that what does diversity mean? Is a huge question. But one of the kind of conclusions we got to is that it's diversity of what? And my kind of fill in the blank would be diversity of experience is what you're looking for. And maybe, yes, that does come from people of different races, people of different sexual orientations, ethnicities. And, we kind of use those labels as, oh, well, we're looking for diversity. We're looking for people of different backgrounds. And in ways, diverse experience can be a natural follower of those diverse identities, but also just finding more and more ways to say, where do you find diverse experience? Where do you find diverse perspective? And then in my conversation with Zeb, I felt like was an example of that he and I had diverse perspectives. We were approaching the same concept or this conversation, and we were bringing diverse perspectives to the conversation. And I learned so much from him by being able to talk to me about data science or tell me the stories of when humor was used in the face of oppression that I'd never heard before and didn't have those as part of my context and my framework. So I was thankful to be able to see that play out in a way. And it just makes me more curious about what your work is. And I'd love to kind of use this as an opportunity to lead into you talking about the book that you're both working on and the kind of ideas you're playing around with. What does that diversity of experience look like, and how do you bring that in a group of people to be the value adding thing, to add the complexity and to kind of help guide people through that growing up?
Yeah. So Abbie, as a lead-in to talking about the book that Arthur and I are working on, I want to just pick up on a couple of things you were saying about the connection between the episode of your conversation with Paul and the episode of your conversation with Zev. And one of the things that I love in just the way you just spoke was you modeled what it means to notice something you hadn't noticed, or a perspective or a world, and engage it with curiosity and eyes wide open, as I'm looking at your eyes
wide open.
As you're talking. So Arthur and I are talking about in our book, what does it mean to recognize conversations about differences, race, gender, sexual orientation? What does it mean to engage in those conversations with humility and responsibility for how we go on together? And one of the things that is important to notice in conversations when we talk about diversity is that oftentimes you'll hear people say, we need a diverse person.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, is that a trigger for me?
Yeah, what a ridiculous thing to say.
Because what we're suggesting is what's normative and what's different. What we're suggesting is what's the central story. This is the outlier story. And what is so important as we're talking about this conversation is that recognizing how that in and of itself, that language limits our view. Right. And what are the ways around talking where we could be expanding differences? And I want to give a small example from myself relative to Zev, because Zev talks about being Jewish. I'm Jewish. Zev and I had very different upbringings, not just generationally. Yeah. He grew up in Indiana as one of the only.
Yeah.
When you are an only in a social world, there's a way in which that lens becomes bigger. And I grew up in New York, where it took a while for me to know that I was part of a group that was not always a dominant group.
Right.
And when I moved to the Midwest, I welcomed the view of how that shifted. And it was a great example of what Paul and Zev both talk about around we know ourselves, we know our stories in relationship with stories that are different and how that expands. And that's part of what Arthur and I are wanting to elevate in our book, which is about what are the ways of engaging in conversations where you recognize your story is just but one.
Yeah.
And the multitudes, even when you have the same quote unquote identity source.
Yeah, you're triggering so many thoughts. One, as I have the notes from Arthur pulled up, is that you and Zev, your order and disorder stages would look so different. And so that's another good maybe asterisk to add to that box framework, is that not order and disorder are going to look different for everyone. You might have exact opposite order and disorders even. And then in Paul's conversation, he talked about that there are 40 million ways to be Black. There are 40 million ways to be, fill in the blank identity. And that's, I think, what I was trying to say with when you're looking for a diversity of perspective, you can't just say, well, let's get a person who's Jewish in here and they'll give us diverse perspective. Yep. Because you need to look at the individual, instead of, like Paul talked about, this broad label, say, well, let's kind of tokenize and pull a person that has that identity and assume that they can speak for everyone, which is not the way to go about embodying diversity, I would say.
And another image for that, and I know you're familiar, and your listeners who've stayed with you through all your episodes have been introduced to the DAISY model, and then that notion of if you put in the center an individual person, and then the petals all around are the different relationships, the different aspects of their identity. I had a friend who, shortly after learning about CMM, said that when they encountered a client or a customer, they imagined the DAISY model slightly above the person's head. And it reminded them that this person has a great deal of complexity. I don't know what those complex issues are. I don't need to know. I just need to know that they've probably had some challenges in their life. They probably have all sorts of ways of thinking about things. And I need to respect that and orient myself to them in that way. And so when you do that, you don't just see them as a member of a minority group or a single aspect of what they're adding to your organization.
It's interesting to build on that. I've been thinking a lot about the recent Supreme Court decision around affirmative action. And when something happens that's jolting, I often take the tact of imagining a future when we're thinking back to this story and seeing what a turning point it was. When I imagine it being a generative turning point, it becomes, and this can be very controversial, but it could become a turning point of recognizing the complexity of identity. That in some ways, the categorizations, what are we wanting to do? What are we wanting to make with those categorizations? And at the time of affirmative action, we recognize the historic marginalization of experiences, the limiting of experiences that people had due to their history, due to their race, due to their gender. And that now we're expanding the narrative and the exploration and the curiosity and the interrogation. What are the structural policies and practices, historical and present, that unfairly limit people? And what can we do to make sure that we are expanding the seats at the table?
Yeah. It's like if you can let yourself not see the Supreme Court decision that you're referring to of affirmative action as the end of the conversation, you can understand it, like we talked about earlier, to bring it full circle, as part of the growing up of our society. And that maybe more and more individuals have done that growing up and can embrace that complexity. But now our next question, our next turn is, what does it look like for the society to actually reflect those values that we individuals hold? And again, like you said, certainly not linear.
Right. Because that may not be fair. That may not be the intention of the current Supreme Court, but it could be ours. And the force that we bring to that could have an impact. And what are the ways in which we then respond in a structural way?
And if you believe in the emergence of what happens in conversation emerging, intention may not matter, because even though the decision might have been intended to bring about one outcome, we don't know that that's what's going to happen. So there's still lots of turns to be taken.
Yeah.
You talk about the social constructionist perspective is that we are players in this conversation. And if we're constantly, from a CMM perspective, we're continuously looking at what are we doing, what are we making, and how do we make it better? And so what are the ways in which we turn something that could feel like despair into an opportunity for a different conversation.
Mm-hmm. I'm seeing another mirror here with my conversation with Paul and where he and I kind of ended of when I said, what's your view of a better social world? He's talking about all of these grand things and saying, I know someone could say that it's kind of silly to even discuss these things because they don't feel close to being something we have. But we ultimately, kind of agreed that it's worth spending that time in your imagination and letting yourself believe what could be possible. Because again, you do have a say in it if you, believe that you are a participant and that you can actually create your social world and be a player in that. Well, just time-wise, I want us to be wrapping up soon. So I want to invite both of you to share any last reflections or thoughts that you had.
I would say that one of the things that really came through all this for me was the struggle for people to have an opportunity. I think Zev said for people to prosper, opportunity to prosper.
Yeah. And, yes, that's the word he used. Yeah.
I think Paul's, was a better social world would be one in which people just approached everything with the greatest curiosity, that they just wanted to know more. And both of those I thought were excellent ways of talking about what a better social world could be. And it also struck me that I mentioned at the outset Richard Rohr's 3 boxes: order, disorder, and reorder. Another quote of his that I absolutely love is, he says, the best form of criticism is to respond to criticism with better practice, a practice of the better. And so as much as there is that we feel wrong with our society or challenging about our society, if we just stay the course of engaging in better communication practices, that's the best criticism of the status quo that we could possibly have.
That's great.
Wow. I really appreciate this conversation. I appreciate the opportunity to have my own perspective be expanded in the conversation of Paul and Zev, and now with Abbie and Arthur. And in final reflection, I'm thinking about how Arthur and I have been engaged in a process of bringing a book to life, and how the challenging moments are also where the opportunity lives. And what's challenging is each turn when we're talking about what does it mean to be white, and how do we look at what may seem like the air we breathe to some people, but look like creators of a history of systemic practices to others. How do we find a way to step back? And it's challenging. It's challenging to notice all of those complexities. And so it reminds me of when I begin to work with a group, a team, an organization, we start with looking at systems literacy, because you have to be able to look at things from a systems perspective in order to recognize the complexity. And you also have to be able to zoom in, zoom out, and zoom in and zoom out. So how do we do that in a way that continues a conversation, doesn't have it be fixed, as a book may sometimes do, but recognizing that each conversation is a point in time. And yet when we have that vision of a better social world, it's an affirming force to acknowledge not knowing, to have cultural humility, and recognize that there is a better future that we can create together. But if I'm not in the conversation with you, I am missing some real opportunities for making sense of how to do that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, Ilene, like you said, like one of my takeaways from my conversations with Paul and Zev was just, I was struck by how much I felt like I learned from them. And as you said, I feel the same about this conversation, that I learned even more from the two of you and got to keep thinking about things and reignite that curiosity about some of these things. So I'm really grateful for both of you joining me today. And I appreciate your perspective and getting to share this conversation with the both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abbie.
Okay, that is where we end this reflection conversation. But if you have lingering questions or ideas or reflections of your own, please do share them with me through email, the website, or by commenting on Instagram or YouTube. There's so many ways for us to stay in dialogue with each other, so I hope that you will take advantage of those so that we can keep creating more meaning together. As always, I am supported in this work by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. Perhaps most meaningful to me is the opportunity to collaborate with the amazing people of the Institute, like Ilene and Arthur, like Sergey, like Barbara, and so many others that enrich my own life and perspective and are just as invested as I am in finding ways to make better meaning in the world and empower others to do the same. So thank you for showing up today. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told. Bye.